No United States, me China o Kutikuna, I tupu ake o United States, I whanau mai au I New York. No United States ahau, ko au te takana o taku whanau, ke tangata tiriti au, ko wiki Chanse taku ingoa, ko tene taku mihi, ki nga tangata whenua o te rohi nei, tena koto tata. Thank you so much for having me. It's really a privilege to be here. The whole reason I got into landscape architecture is to work with community groups and bring landscape architecture skills to the table in these university community partnerships. So I'm still navigating this. I arrived in New Zealand in 2019, and so I've been a bit cautious about just going out and doing community design because there's so much I'm still learning about Aotearoa and just the region. So next slide, please. So, Liz was very kind. I sent her an earlier draft of this talk, and I wanted to make sure I was able to respond, to working with meeting all of you and showing you what we do. So what I wanted to cover these sort of three questions. What are some co-design approaches that we've used working with students? And I'm going to show you some quick examples from the States because I did have some long-term partnerships with stream groups, with watershed groups, as well as just some cities and neighborhood associations in the States. So I wanted to show you some examples of approaches we've been using in the past. And then thinking about this question about how are these findings, from engagement with school kids, with community members, how do we take those findings, how are they then applied and used, especially in the context of stormwater and habitat restoration, given the focus of today. And then lastly, in what ways did the community effort come to fruition? So next slide, please, Liz. Thanks. So what are some co-design approaches working with students? This was actually a sea level rise project back in 2010. I've been working on these kinds of community design projects around watersheds and waterfronts since about 2007. And so this was sort of, this was a community. We were looking at just some sea level design approaches and coming up with different options. So anyway, sorry, next slide, please. So to give you a quick overview about, there's some of us community designers out there, and clearly you always tailor this to fit each situation, but an overall approach to what I do when we work with students and community partners in terms of our community meetings with you, with potential partners, is first listening, and so really taking a chance to hear the community concerns. In the context of stormwater, are there areas where there's nuisance flooding, identifying which areas, even if there's a bad smell from the waterway, for example, thinking about potential habitat needs, are there particular areas where it's really eroding quite quickly? And then on the positive side, when you think about places that are really valued in the community, what are some important places that we need to take into account? What's some of the history, some of the culture that we need to take into consideration? Then the students and I sort of take that with us, and we start to look at it from a, what we like to call a desktop analysis, looking at a site sort of overview of the area, and sort of taking, some of what we've heard from the meeting and starting to spatialize it, really. And then having a second follow-up meeting to sort of do a ground truthing. Did we hear you correctly? Did we identify important areas? Did we identify important concerns? And so that's just sort of, in the design process, for the 12-week term. The third meeting, students come up with some quick design ideas. And so, again, each project has differed so much. Like we've had some projects with communities where there's one specific site. With some of the watershed groups I worked with, it was different sites. The students sort of identified different areas along the catchment area that they wanted to develop designs. And some of this, might be right alongside the stream, but some of it also may be, say, schools within the catchment area, or thinking about what are ways that we can connect the neighborhood more to the stream. Those sorts of things. And it's been really, for some of these projects, the communities I'm working with, some of it's, like that first image of the students looking at sea level rise, sometimes it's almost overwhelming in the beginning. But what's really nice is that the students come in without an agenda. And there's something very positive when they come up with so many different potential design approaches, in terms of how we might make new ways to connect to this stream or reconnect to this stream, or how we might, redesign a waterfront, or redesign a community park. And that's been really wonderful. And then sort of a final meeting just with the students, usually a presentation, and then there's the follow-up after. But I just wanted to give you an overview because I know, I want to thank you, Liz, so much for giving me feedback on the first approach to this talk, because there's so much lingo we can tend to throw out, and just making sure that I'm able to follow through with this after, we work together and the students have their final assignments. So next slide, please. So this is one of the stream groups we started working with. This is part of a larger project, just looking at water stream health for the Chesapeake Bay region, just outside of Washington, D.C. in the States. And so that's a litter trap. Some of you may recognize that. But this is the Anacostia River. This is one of the most at-risk rivers in the States. And so this is, next slide, please. So this is, this was an undergraduate studio project. And so, we were working, we had our community partners, we had Maryland Sea Grants, we had Groundworks Anacostia, which is the local stream group. And so we were identifying different projects, along sections of the Watts Branch, which is a catchment area of the Anacostia watershed. And so they were looking at potential improvements. I know previous speakers mentioned water-sensitive design, thinking about potential opportunities for stormwater, lighting, sidewalks, bike lanes, plantings, and then looking at the current development issues as well. Next slide, please. So this is, again, some of this, sometimes it's great when you have a day like today that's been so well, created for us to share feedback and learn from each other. At the same time, we also try to design interactive activities for people who may not have much time. And so, the students, I'm always so, impressed and inspired by them because they come up with so many new ways to interact with different communities. And so this was just one quick design game that this one team did. And they just stood outside the train station when people were coming out after work and saying, hey, can we just 3 minutes, we'll give you 3 yellow stickers and just put it on whichever outdoor activities you enjoy. And these are ways of capturing, things we might not even, a lot of us wouldn't even think of. And so, when we think about what do you do with the data, it was really interesting just to see, like, water park, like 11 people, which is the highest number, chose that. Some people chose dancing, and it's just sort of a really nice way to quickly get some feedback. Next slide, please. So yeah, this was just some of the findings, looking at how students might take this and say, okay, water parks were the most popular for the Watts Branch sub-watershed. Biking and basketball came in second, lounging in an open field was next. I never, would have thought about this because I don't know how to play chess, but a place to play chess was the 4th popular activity. And then we're able to sort of take that into a graph. Next slide, please. That was just one team. Some of the other teams, the student teams, just wanted to, I thought for a moment, I've probably been talking about stormwater too much because this was all about Green Street, stream restoration, a green whale trail, a rain garden, bioswale, and then also neighborhood murals. So they just wanted, they were just sort of doing, again, stopping by the train station. Next slide, please. Yeah, this goes back to the sea level rise project, this most at-risk one. And I just wanted to show you, before we go out, I always run some of the graphics by, other people who've been doing this kind of work. And this was the first time I was doing a sea level rise project. And so I ran this by up in Vancouver at the University of British Columbia. They'd been doing a lot of sea level rise design workshops. And so one thing that they always bring back is, the designers, if it's landscape architects or others, just being able to quickly sketch out some ideas because it's not set in stone, but it's a way to sort of continue the conversation about what other approaches we might use. Next slide, please. This was a group also on the Eastern Shore. So Maryland's Eastern Shore is really at risk because you have marsh migration, you have oxidizing soil, so the ground is slowly sinking, it's very low lying. And so this was part of a larger project, a larger team. We're working with church groups in Teal Islands. And this was a serious issue because there's so many African American churches that were losing access to their churches and to important cultural sites, with nuisance flooding. There's just a tremendous amount of nuisance flooding. Even though there wasn't a lot of wave action, just the shape of the landscape, you had so much flooding. And so we met with some of the church groups to start to identify, where along the roads, because people had trouble getting to their churches and getting home, in addition to churches being at risk from sea level rise. Next slide, please. So yeah, this is just sort of, you can see nuisance flooding is the yellow, sites of importance and miscellaneous, and we were just trying to sort of strategize. And this was sort of we met in different areas with different church groups trying to identify important sites, and then breaking out into meeting groups. Next slide, please. This is another project. I just wanted to give you guys a sense of the different approaches that some of the students and I have used. So sometimes it's a quick, let's stand outside by the rail station or bus stop. Sometimes it's let's spend half a day on a Saturday because we know there's a community event and we can set up a table and show some, trying to get feedback really quickly from community members. And then sometimes it's longer. So I've had the longest workshop I've led with students has been a 4-day workshop. This one was a 2-day workshop. And so these were graduate students. And they all came up with some really interesting activities. So one was how to use the park now. And so there's a mapping activity. That one team started to look at different, sports, water sports, education, commercial, cultural. Some students did a photo voice, so just having community members take pictures in advance of our workshop about important sites around the park that they really valued and they wanted us to take care of, our sites that they were concerned about. And then during the workshop, we were then able to take time to sort of go through the photographs with community members and say, okay, let's talk a little bit more about this and how we might take this into our final design responses. Can you go back a little bit? Yeah, and then, pros and cons, just ways to get people to think more creatively. I mean, we've all been to community meetings, and the first thing about a community meeting is people to start to say what they don't want, right? And that's a natural response. And, it was interesting to see, that it did very much start out that day. There are actually even radio ads saying, who is the University of Maryland coming in? What are they doing to our park? And it was all these worries, it's completely understandable. You're worried, there's things you really like and you want to make sure that they don't change. But it was really interesting from Thursday until the next day, Friday, there was definitely a shift because you start to have small exercises like, what would you do in this park if you had 3 months or 3 weeks versus 3 months versus 3 years? And just getting a way to have people start thinking more incrementally about different design approaches. Next slide, please. And so, this is just an image. That's the photo voice group in the back corner and just some quick sketching. So this is the other great approach with students. We bring in some trace paper and we start to spatialize some of those ideas, and it could be the issues and the concerns, and then, thinking about what are some design solutions we might work with. Next slide, please. So this one, so then I arrived here in the second half of 2019, and then as you know, in 2020, it was a very different world. So this is a group of graduate students, Masters of Landscape Architecture students, and we were just talking about how do we start to engage community. So this team, Bliss, Joanna, and Laura, I thought they were looking at Pororua for their design studio, and so they just came up with which I still think is such a wonderful interactive activity, but they were looking at mapping food sheds in the area. And so in the left-hand corner is sort of a way to think about distance, like how if we want to have fresh food available within a certain distance, how can, using that scale throughout the region. And so they started to identify different types of food sources, and mapping that out. So I just wanted to share that. Next slide, please. So what do we do with all of this? And I'm very cognizant. I don't want to take this heavy-handed approach from another country and bring it here. And so I'm really looking to all of you and to talking with you about how do we move this forward. So one example, Nidhi Solanki is in the room today. She is a master's student looking at Pororua for her Master's of Landscape Architecture thesis this year. And so when I was going through this again, the implementation program, it was wonderful to see all of the values that community members have expressed in terms of what's important in the watershed. And then I went through, all the different pollutants, storm, non-point source pollutant runoffs, and that sort of thing. Next slide, please. And it's really this question now from a landscape architecture scale. When I think about our potential role, or say Nidhi looking at this, her potential role, how do we take the science, of the non-point source pollutants, of where there might be nuisance flooding, the proposed district plan had the flood hazards, the coastal hazards, tsunami hazards, important natural areas, and how do we start to bring this to the ground level, to our scale, and think about what are some potential design interventions that we may take to connect people within the neighborhood to the stream, connect the schools to the stream, and other considerations and design around that. So, of course, always taking into consideration, habitat restoration, riparian planting, some of the wonderful work that you have already talked about this morning, but sort of thinking about this across these different scales. Next slide, please. So this brings me back to how are co-design outcomes applied? Sorry, can you go back a bit? So before I move on, that's just sort of a question I have. That's something, for all these projects that I've worked on in the past, it's trying to get the best, knowledge, local knowledge, hydrology, habitat, landscape ecology knowledge, because I see landscape architects as bringing these together and sort of spatializing this and finding, how do we weave this together to address all of these issues? Okay. So, taking that and thinking about how do we start to take these outcomes with the design approaches, and then, what ways the community effort might come to fruition. Nice. So, taking a step back again, I'm just drawing from past experience, but in terms of what we've done in the past, is we did use, in the States, it was important to get public feedback on a lot of projects. And so our community partners were able to say, well, the students led this, 2-day workshop, and we had this many participants, and here was all the findings from all of these different interactive activities in terms of what people valued, in terms of what was important, in terms of their concerns. The other ways in which the student design ideas have been applied include, in Maryland, the state I was working in last, you can't compete with the professional landscape architects. So a lot of these communities, they were able to choose from, say 20 different student designs and say, okay, for this wetland park, everyone loved bird watching. So they chose the student bird watching design idea in the final project with the master plan and the design details. Say, okay, let's now use this to craft the request for proposals for the professional landscape architects, or to apply for funding. And so the student design ideas have been used for that as well, because we always give it back to the community members. Like, okay, here's all the student work, and I would have follow-up meetings and say, okay, let's talk through what you're looking for, and then using that in funding proposals. And they were really successful. There were a lot of, we were really lucky. The communities that it was helpful for them, and they were able to get funding, and they were able to use it for formal requests for proposals. And then fostering long-term ideas. I mean, there's some projects, so those Eastern Shore projects in Maryland, I started working on the sea level rise projects in 2010, and I was working on them, within the larger region, but focusing on different small rural communities until I left, until 2019. In South Carolina, so south of Washington, D.C., that group felt very disenfranchised. There was a whole sort of master planning approach that those residents were going through, and they were being subjected to, and they're completely left out of the planning process. And so, that was really helpful too. That was the 4-day workshop. And so, even just, our community partners and our city contact, they kept calling it Stromboli Corridor, but we realized residents didn't even know what Stromboli Corridor meant, or what site we were referring to. So even things like place names were really important. And then in that case, the community feeling very disenfranchised, it was really nice to have students coming in without an agenda and really spending a lot of time listening. We spent those 4 days. We had some, drop-in area at a local church. We had a drop-in area at a community center. We set up different stations throughout the city if people couldn't make the meetings. And so what they were able to take, the formal consultants who were being paid to do this were able to take that feedback and actually put it into that master plan for that larger community. So that was really heartening to see. Thanks. So, oh, sorry. Oh, 2 more minutes. Okay.
Yeah.
So, okay. Yeah, priority areas, planting. So planting plans. I cut out all the beautiful diagrams. I'm happy to meet with you and show you more later. One caveat: we are not civil engineers, but I do make it a common practice to bring in ecological scientists, civil engineers, as well as community partners to give us feedback throughout each stage of the design process. Next slide, please. So just challenges, constraints, time frame, constrained resources, learning curve for the students. Next slide, please. Potential opportunities. So around September, October, the 2024 students need to come up with their proposal ideas for their Masters of Landscape Architecture's thesis ideas. So if any of you are interested, please feel free to contact me. I know Stephen Hartley at the Kelburn campus said to let him know, because he teaches an ecological restoration class next term, which starts July 10th. So he's also, he's worked with a lot of local groups, so a lot of you probably know him, but he said to let him know if there are any other projects he'd like to assign to his ecological restoration class, because he partners up each student with a community group. Yeah, and I'm always open to other suggestions, ideas. Pollinator paths, they're in the area, so Andrea Reed is really interested in making contact, so she's been looking at pollinator pathways in the region. She just moved here a little while ago from Auckland. She's a landscape architect and is now in the Wellington area. Next slide, please. Okay, just a quick, I had to show some beautiful graphics. So, you can see the larger scale, looking at the habitat needs for the Australian bittern, potential habitat restoration, wetland design ideas, but yeah, one slide. Okay, next slide, please, which I believe is the last one. Thank you.